Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1096 is actually insane, and I know I say that every week, but the Egghead arc just keeps outdoing itself. There are a ton of details in this chapter surrounding the Rocks Pirates, from Shiki to Amazon Lily, all the way to the zombies of Thriller Bark, being several of the Rocks Pirates themselves, and I'm going to talk about all of this in depth. If you've been enjoying these breakdowns, I'd really appreciate it if you hit like and subscribed. It really helps the channel grow, and you'll get these videos as soon as they come out. But with that said, let's get right into chapter 1096, Kuma Chi. We're continuing the Kuma flashback that started in the previous chapter, and we get a wider shot of the center of God Valley. And between this chapter and the previous one, it seems to be inspired by old western settings with the general store and the way the inhabitants of the island are dressed. In front of the stage seems to be a lineup of the Holy Knights from that era, and we actually get a good look at a couple of them throughout this chapter. The Holy Knights were first mentioned toward the end of the Wano arc during a discussion between Akainu and Tensei, and we got the silhouette of the current iteration of the group during this current arc when Dragon, Ivankov, and Sabo were discussing their affairs. Of course, these designs don't necessarily match the ones we see here in this chapter since this is taking place 38 years ago, but the silhouettes from 1083 also don't match Garling's hair and beard, so that was likely just some of Oda's classic ambiguous silhouettes at play. One of them seems to be from the Manmeyer family, which potentially adds a new name to the list of original 20 families. So far, we have 3 that are explicitly confirmed with the Nefertari family, the Don Quixote family, and more recently, the Nerona family. There are, of course, the families of the Elders with the J. Garcia family, the Marcus family, the Topman family, the Ethan Barron family, and the Shepherd family. Now, these family names have not been explicitly confirmed to be part of the original 20, but they are pretty likely. And in a similar situation, there is the Figureland family with Garling and, as suggested, Shanks. So if all of these potential names turn out to be part of the original 20, then so far we have half of the families accounted for. Now, I've seen a fun theory that these Holy Knights may be the kids from the House of Lambs. I don't really buy this. I feel like the fandom tries to make a connection between those kids and any group of characters that vaguely resembles them. It's been happening all the way since the Whole Cake Island arc, with people suggesting that this kid was actually Dufeld. There's also been theories that the kid with the mask and the long arm kid were actually CP0's Maha and Joseph. I don't really buy into these ideas too much. We also get a glimpse of a few other Holy Knights later on, a woman and a guy with an ox skull mask, or maybe it's just his head. The skull is somewhat interesting as these ox skulls tend to be used for occult imagery, and in my 1094 breakdown I discussed how this could be related to Saturn, so check that out if you haven't yet. Also of note, it appears that the celestial dragons ride on these giant birds, perhaps ostriches or emus. This reminded me a bit of the supersonic duck squadron that served the kingdom of Alabasta. Perhaps there's something here with the original royal families using various birds for transportation. Also of note, if these are supposed to be emus, there's a bit of fun wordplay with the secret ruler of the world, Emu, though it should be stated that they are not pronounced nor written in the same way in the Japanese. We cut to Marine headquarters to find what looks to be a young Kong delivering some orders to a young Garp. We first got a hint of Kong back in Chapter 0 when he was the Fleet Admiral 27 years ago, but we wouldn't see him in full until the Marineford arc when he was the Commander-in-Chief of the world government's military. Now in this chapter, it looks like he may actually just be an Admiral, as this is taking place 38 years ago, and the room that he's in much more closely resembles the room that Sengoku was in as an Admiral 13 years ago. In fact, the room we see Fleet Admiral Kong in back in Chapter 0 matches the room that Sengoku occupied 2 years ago as the Fleet Admiral. So all of this together suggests to me that Kong was only an admiral 38 years ago. And if this is true, it's kind of remarkable how much attention Oda pays to little things like this to maintain continuity, and for context's sake, Akainu's office in present day would not match any of these rooms, since he is a new Marineford while Sengoku and Kong were in charge of the original Marineford. Garp seems to be lounging somewhere else. Perhaps this is Vacation Island as it was 38 years ago. Vacation Island is where Mr. 3 and Miss Golden Week were before heading to Little Garden, and it's where the Baroque Works cover story would take place later on. Both locations have these tropical trees and the pool, but there's also a very similar design for the ground with these circles. Either way, Garp suggests that the Celestial Dragons may have taken the treasure of Fololed. Now, it's not exactly clear what is being referred to here, but later on the Rocks Pirates seem to be fighting over the fish fruit model Azure Dragon, so perhaps Kaido's fruit is more important than we realize. Alternatively, I wonder if whatever this treasure is was actually Captain John's treasure. Buggy seemed so certain that it was hidden on an island with a large skull formation, which is exactly what Fololed is, but we'll just have to see. Now, Garp is told that Roger is headed for God Valley, which sparks Garp's interests as we see him charging in later on in the chapter, and alongside him is, of course, Bogard, who hasn't really aged a day. We hadn't seen him at all since the post-Enies Lobby arc until recently, where we got a brief glimpse of him aboard Garp's ship at Fololed. Over on God Valley, we see Ivankov rallying the other slaves, who all seem to have literal targets on their backs. It seems they've been told that if they survive for 3 weeks, they'll be freed, and this of course is a lie to make the hunt more exciting for the Celestial Dragons, and it reminds me a bit of Zoro's situation at the start of the series, with Morgan and Helmeppo promising his freedom if he stayed there for a month. It seems this event is actually being broadcast in Mary Joa as well. Ivankov's handcuffs get broken by a fisherman slave, and we've seen throughout the series how strong the jaws of a shark fisherman can actually be, and in general how fierce this species of fishermen are. Interestingly though, Ivankov was not depicted with handcuffs in the previous chapters, so this may be fixed in the volume edition. Ginny seems to be very adept at broadcasting. She mentions that the events on the island have been sent out to the world, which is likely the reason why the Rocks Pirates and the Roger Pirates sailed to God Valley in the first place. Perhaps this is also how Garp knew about the treasure earlier in the chapter as well. Now Ginny explains that the prizes at the center of the island are devil fruits, and among them are the mythical fish fruit that Kaido wields in present day, and the pawpaw fruit, Kuma's fruit. Interestingly, while the pawpaw fruit has been associated with bears with Kuma's motif, it is shown here represented as a cat. The fruit was also associated with cats when Robin first heard of the fruit's powers. Now this may work thematically with the Egghead arc and Vegapunk satellites, who were created as a result of Vegapunk needing more hands, and in the original Japanese text, this was expressed through the idiom of being so busy that you would ask for a cat's paw for help. Thus, that's why the satellites are often referred to with the kanji for cat. Now we had previously seen the shape of Kaido's fruit earlier in this arc when Vegapunk was explaining the potential of recreating Zoan fruits. However, this is the first time we've seen the shape of Kuma's fruit, and interestingly it features 3 circles for the paw shape, while every time the fruit has been used, it features 4. It actually more so resembles Kuma's symbol, something you know I've been wondering about for a long time if you've been watching my previous breakdowns. Now this whole jailbreak situation is very reminiscent of Impel Down, with Ivankov helping the wielder of the Nika fruit escape 2 years ago, and helping Kuma, who wished to be a hero like Nika, escape here on God Valley. Now let's talk about what we've all been waiting for. We get our first explicit look at the Rocks Pirates. There are a ton of familiar faces here, so let's just get the ones we know out of the way. Of course, we have Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido, who we knew were part of the crew when the existence of the Rocks Pirates were first introduced during Wano. There are a few things to note here, however. Now, in the depiction of Roger and Garp against the Rocks Pirates, Big Mom seemed to be wearing her fedora-like hat that she was shown with 44 years ago when meeting Kaido, and also 40 years ago as depicted in the SBS. Here, she's wearing Napoleon. Interestingly, after the events of God Valley, she's seen wearing a different fedora hat when looking for Kaido. Now this may just be a continuity oversight. She also has Prometheus here with her, but Zeus is nowhere in sight, and we know she had both of these homies as a child. But this is the earliest depiction of Napoleon, as she was previously shown with him as early as 25 years ago during Oden's flashback. Now off in the corner, you can actually make out Streusen, who we were first introduced to as one of Big Mom's gourmet knights in present day, but was soon after shown to be a failed pirate cook who helped Big Mom with her pirating career over the years. Kaido looks a little bit different than how he was portrayed right before leaving for God Valley, though his exact interest in Roger is a little hard to place here as it's cut off by Big Mom, creating another lingering thread for Kaido's history. Whitebeard, however, looks fairly similar to how he did 30 years ago when he landed on Wano, but notice that he doesn't bear his Jolly Roger as his crew wouldn't be formed just yet. Instead, it seems to simply be a skull with a mustache, perhaps his own personal Jolly Roger. Now back during the Rocks' introduction, we also got a few more epithets and names: the Golden Lion, the Silver Axe, Captain John, and Wang Ji. The Golden Lion of course refers to Shiki, who we first met back in Chapter 0. We also saw a glimpse of his face when he was young during Orochi's flashback when Higurashi assumed his appearance briefly with the clone fruit, which suggested that she had made contact with the Rocks Pirates at some point. Now many people have wondered if Shiki would ever be a main part of the story, since Chapter 0, despite being canon, was released as part of the promotion for the film Strong World, so it's great to see him here, and it's going to be interesting to see if he'll make it into the present day storyline. The end of Chapter 0 leaves him plotting with something that would take at least 20 years to come to fruition, and that would roughly line up with where we are today, but we'll just have to see. Now, we first heard of Captain John back during the Jaya arc, as Buggy was searching for his treasure, and we would later see his corpse on Thriller Bark as one of Moria's zombies, and afterwards, Luffy would unknowingly gravitate toward an armband that we would find out during the Impel Down arc was a treasure marker that led to John's treasure. In Volume 49's SBS, we learned that John died at the hands of his own crew after having tried to keep all of his treasure for himself. Now this is very interesting because we know that the Rocks Pirates were constantly killing one another and infighting, and we see that on display in this chapter with all of them butting heads and fighting over the treasure. Perhaps God Valley was where John met his end. He's also wearing the same outfit here that his corpse was back on Thriller Bark. Now, him being called captain may suggest that he had his own crew when he died, but with all of this infighting, it's not impossible that he was just asserting himself as the captain, but we'll get into all the crazy possibilities of this in just a bit. There are a few other familiar faces here as we see a young Buckingham Stussy hanging on to Whitebeard. Now, we had learned Stussy was originally a rocks pirate earlier in this arc in chapter 1072 and chapter 1073, and her pairing with Whitebeard here may actually prove that she wasn't lying about being Whitebeard's lover. However, there is someone here who might have something to say about this, and that's Gloriosa, the former Kuja Empress from over 3 generations ago. We first met her during the Amazon Lily arc and learned that she had left the Kuja to sail on the outer seas before eventually returning. Now, her presence on the rocks provides a lot of context as she had to have left the Kuja over 38 years ago, but after they disbanded, she remained on the seas until 15 years ago when she encountered the Boa sisters who were freed from Marijoa by Fisher Tiger. We learned that the Kuja Empresses all suffered from lovesickness, but Gloriosa survived by leaving Amazon Lily. She had also said that Boa saved her own life by choosing to go with Luffy, which suggests that Gloriosa saved herself by choosing to go with the man that she had fallen for, and from this chapter, it looks to me that Gloriosa was infatuated with none other than Whitebeard. Now, this is pretty interesting, as a later Kuja Empress, Shaki, was seemingly fall for Rayleigh, who was part of the enemy pirate crew, the Roger Pirates. Now, we know Stussy ended up with Mads after the Rocks Pirates disbanded, but it's unknown what Gloriosa was up to during that 23-year gap before she returned to Amazon Lily. The two seem to be competing over Whitebeard's hand, so could Gloriosa have actually won and been with Whitebeard during that whole time? Now, the last handful of Rocks Pirates are characters that we don't really know just yet, but what if I told you that we may have actually seen them before in the story? There are several Rocks Pirates here who have a striking resemblance to some of the zombies from Thriller Bark, and we knew Captain John was a former Rocks Pirate and his corpse ended up with Moria, but it looks like he may not have been the only one. John was introduced as part of the General Zombies, a classification of zombies reserved for some of the strongest corpses in Moria's possession. They were commanded by Absalom, and among them are a few characters that could very well line up with some of the Rocks Pirates that we see in this chapter. First and foremost is this Rocks Pirate with the helmet and beard. This design is very reminiscent of this huge hulking General Zombie labeled 889. He seems to be a bit of a centaur, with his lower half being the legs of an elephant, but with all of this stitching present, it seems possible that this was the work of Hogback, who provided similar augmentations to the corpses on the island. The shape of the helmet as it wraps around the face is identical, as well as the several bolts or impressions that run up the forehead area, and even the facial features of the eyes, nose, and lips are nearly identical. Then, there's the Rocks Pirate below him in the spread, whose face is heavily obscured by what seems to be a hat. This may be the same pirate that we saw above, positioned right below Kaido's club. He seems to be wielding pistols with his 4 arms, and has what looks to be a brimmed hat. This design is extremely similar to another General Zombie that rose from the ground of Thriller Bark, though this one was not featured much after this initial scene. The pistols, the 4 arms, and even the hat are all there. While there is the possibility that some of these arms were added to the corpse, I should note that 4-armed humans do exist in the world of One Piece, as we saw one living in Chocolate Town during the Whole Cake Island arc. Now, above Whitebeard's shoulder is another pirate with these claw-like weapons. This may very well be the General Zombie that we see next to 889, who uses a similar pair of weapons. And on the other side of Whitebeard is a huge man that seems to resemble the fisherman Sunbel or Sambel on Roger's crew. It's not really clear who this is, but the body shape is very reminiscent of the General Zombie standing beside 889. Then, there's also this Rocks Pirate below Kaido's knee with the cutlass and the spiked hair. That may line up with this General Zombie labeled 824, but this one is just a pure guess. Personally, I feel like the resemblance between the last 2 Rocks Pirates and the 889 zombie and the 4-armed zombie is pretty uncanny. I wouldn't be surprised if one of these was the Silver Axe that we first heard of when the Rocks Pirates were being introduced. Wang Ji could be among these, but they were definitely not among the zombies, as of course they were alive as recently as 2 years ago when Blackbeard toppled him and took control of Fololed. Now, there is a General Zombie here who wields an axe, but the Silver Axe seems to be an epithet, so it may not necessarily describe the character's weapons. For example, Qin Zhao is known as the Drill, but he doesn't use a drill himself, rather his abilities resemble one. Also, we've seen that the abilities of zombies are much more dependent on their shadow, while the strength comes from the corpse. Now, these observations have of course created an array of questions, but one in particular stands out to me. How did Moria get all of these corpses? Well, we know he's been collecting various bodies throughout the years, going as far back as over 20 years ago, when he broke into Ryuma's grave on Wano. Perhaps he tracked down various rocks pirates after their death and nabbed their corpses. That's definitely possible. But what if all the rocks pirate corpses were there in one place, ready for the picking? With the clash between the Rocks Pirates and Garp and Roger, God Valley was likely devastated, and we've seen the pure damage that someone like Garp can do to an island all by himself. Between all of these great combatants, the island may have been brought to the point of being unrecognizable. It's also possible that the Rocks Pirates not only disbanded at God Valley, but several were left behind or killed. We learned from Sengoku that God Valley disappeared, but he never said that the government destroyed the island. His statement was that the island the government wanted to hide disappeared entirely. Notice how there's no causality in that statement. The government wanted it gone and it disappeared, but it's never stated that they got rid of it themselves. So far, the only means we've seen of the government being able to wipe out an island has been through the Buster Call or the device used to destroy Leloucha. And we've seen the Buster Call leaves behind the foundation of the island, while the device used on Leloucha does get rid of the island entirely, but it was not operable until relatively recently thanks to York supplying the Mother Flame. So, given what we know, the government would not be able to fully make an island disappear at this time. So what if the island wasn't destroyed, but rather moved? While God Valley being in the West Blues solves the mystery of Shanks' statement of his hometown being in that ocean, it may also work to answer the question of what island Thriller Bark was created around, as we know it too is from the West Blue. This would be a rather clean fix, right? As it explains how the island disappeared, how Moria got all of these corpses, everything works. Well, what doesn't? Moria was 48 years old before the time skip, meaning that he would have been 12 years old at the time of God Valley. Plus, in the Vivre card database, it was said that Moria constructed Thriller Bark after his defeat to Kaido, which happened 23 years ago, meaning God Valley would have been around for about 15 years before it disappeared at Moria's hand. I suppose that that's not actually impossible, as back then the world was definitely not as globalized as it is now, so the government could have just censored the maps to not include the island in the meantime before the island disappeared years later. But if Thriller Bark is the remnants of a desecrated God Valley, then there could be some more pieces of the puzzle that come together. We've seen Moria is not a particularly strong pirate historically, but even so, according to the Vivre cards, he was allowed the status of a warlord not too long after his devastating defeat at Kaido's hands. Perhaps Moria was able to hold the remnants of the Rocks Pirates as well as the God Valley over the heads of the world government, which in turn allowed for his spot among the warlords. Him having access to the corpses of the Rocks Pirates would certainly increase the government's leverage against the 4 emperors, of which 3 were former Rocks Pirates themselves. Moreover, perhaps the world government's mysterious decision to permanently take out Moria wasn't simply motivated by his failures, but because the strongest man alive, Edward Newgate, was no longer a threat, meaning Moria's leverage was no longer needed. After all, isn't it strange how former warlords were merely imprisoned for failing or even crossing the government, while Moria was specifically ordered to be killed? It feels like Moria may know a little bit too much. Now, this is all a bit of conjecture at this point surely, but there may be something here with all of this. It may not be a coincidence that Moria was written to be at Fololed and included by name in this current arc. There's also something to be said about Moria having brought Thriller Bark to Fololed, and with it the corpses of several Rocks pirates, the crew whose captain is the namesake of the main ship of the Blackbeard's pirates, the Saber of Zebek, as noted in the Vivre cards. But that's enough about Rocks. We also have the Roger pirates arriving on the scene. Of course, we have Roger at the center who speaks on the past year. Recall that this is taking place a year after his crew arrived on Lodestar Island 39 years ago. This is probably the earliest we've seen the Roger pirates on their journey, with Roger not even having his iconic mustache just yet, and looking like Ace more than ever. Of note, he's lacking his bifold captain's hat as he was depicted with in the rendition of this incident during the Wano arc. Beside him is of course Rayleigh to one side and Scopper Gabon on the other. We had seen versions of these characters in Buggy's flashback during the Orangetown arc, but we first saw their reimagined designs in Chapter 0, which have been used ever since. Behind Roger is Yui, who we first saw during Odin's flashback and got their design and name in full in Volume 96's SBS. Behind Scopper is Sunbell or Sambell, a fishman who we first saw in Chapter 0, but wasn't yet named until Volume 96. To the side of Scopper is Spencer, a crewmate who we first saw during Odin's flashback and also named in Volume 96, and beneath him is Millet Pine, who we also first saw in Odin's flashback and was also named in Volume 96. Of note, we see Roger's ship, the Oro Jackson, but we can't really make out the backside of it, so it's unclear if the mysterious egg on the ship is there at this point in time. Meanwhile, Kuma and Ivankov make it to the center and grab the mythical fish fruit and the pawpaw fruit, but Eva is stopped by Big Mom. The mythical fish fruit would ultimately end up being given to Kaido to save his life, as we learned back on Wano. Now Kuma manages to eat his fruit, but ends up getting knocked back by Saturn, and from the sound effects here, it seems like Saturn did this through his Devil Fruit's force creating abilities, as opposed to anything physical. Now in my 1094 breakdown, I had wondered if Kuma had seen Saturn in his true form before, and it seems like we may get that to be the case should they fight right here. However, we're quickly reminded that this is the Kuma flashback and not the God Valley flashback, so we cut away and return to Sorbet Kingdom to find that Kuma has saved more than 500 people from God Valley. We find Kuma living in a church and praying, which may explain his decision to carry a Bible with him as we saw before the time skip. We also learned that Morgans had reported on the God Valley incident. This is extremely curious, as Morgans was said to be 53 in present day according to the Vivre cards, making him only 15 years old at the time of the God Valley incident. It'll be interesting to see what develops of this. Perhaps this age will turn out to be incorrect. Either way, Morgans having been active for nearly 4 decades is insane. Now Ivankov heads off in search of their own adventure while Ginny stays behind and lives with Kuma. We see Kuma doing woodcutting to maintain a living, placing this as the time period from which Oda drew a young Kuma in Volume 63's SPS. During this time, Kuma is bullied by local children who get dealt with by Ginny. But of note, these kids seem to grow up to be part of Bonnie's crew in the future. We initially saw these guys back on the Sabaody Archipelago arc, and last saw them during the post-war arc when Bonnie was captured by Blackbeard. And we learned in the Vivre cards that Bonnie was able to escape, but she left her crew behind, which is why she arrived on Egghead all alone. This, along with Kuma saying Ginny eats a lot, which matches Bonnie's epithet of the glutton, really throws a wrench into Bonnie's history. Could she be the daughter of Ginny, or perhaps even her clone? I'm sure we're on the edge of finding out the truth, and everything will be answered in the coming weeks. And that's about it for all the big things that I wanted to talk about in this chapter. I'd love to hear what you have to think in the comments, and if you've enjoyed my thoughts here or have been enjoying my breakdowns in general, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. It really does go a long way in helping the channel grow. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.